how might a national economy be faring if there was no corona? In other words, if there were no COVIDs, pandemica, gremlins throwing sand into the economic gears, how would an economy be faring in present circumstances? Would the engine be running? Believe it or not, there is such a country, and perhaps we can learn from it. That country is Japan. My name is Emil Kalinowski. This is Making Sense, a Eurodollar University production. I am joined by the esteemed Eurodollar master, Jeff Snider, head of global research for Alhambra Investments. Jeff, Thanksgiving success?
Thanksgiving is always a success because there's so much that's good about it. And there's really, as much as we get into the doom and gloom and the bad side of the monetary system and the economy and all that stuff, there's still quite a lot we can be thankful for, including, as we talked about last week, the vaccine, an end to the COVID pandemic that has now become, that's now visible and in sight. So there are things to be thankful for, and yet there's still a lot of work to be done.
A lot of work to be done might be the conclusion of this episode. The article that we're going to be referencing, for those of you that want to follow along, it was posted on November 20th at the Alhambra Investments blog post. The title you want to search is, get your pencils out, QQE to the moon, deflation returns to Japan anyway. Jeff, so the 29th of January 2016, the Bank of Japan announced that it would implement negative interest rates. Let me read a little quote here. At the monetary policy meeting held today, the policy board of the Bank of Japan decided to introduce quantitative and qualitative monetary easing with a negative interest rate in order to achieve the price stability target of 2% at the earliest possible time. The Financial Times that same day wrote that this was, quote, stunning analysts, but what the heck, sparking a surge in equity and bond markets. The newspaper noted a response, all of this was in response to mounting worries about the outlook in China and the risks of a global slowdown. So just setting the scene, early January 2016, negative interest rates. You start your article about 5 months later, like midsummer. What was happening then in Japan?
Well, for one thing, the response in markets, stocks and bond markets, lasted all of one day. Negative interest rates for the Bank of Japan was an utter and complete embarrassment. It did absolutely nothing. It did, yes, the global economy was slowing down. The Bank of Japan already more than 2 years into QQE, still was nowhere near its inflation nor economic goals, and so they decided, well, we'll do a negative interest rates because that's the next logical step. That fell flat on its face. That didn't do much of anything for Japan. And so by September, July, late summer, August, and into September, they decided we got to do something else. We got to get this inflation stuff going because inflation is the signal and the corroboration that economic growth is actually taking place that we want to see. Full employment, things moving. The monetary system contributing positively to the economic processes that we call recovery. And so, but if you're a central bank that doesn't actually intervene in the monetary system, how can you get yourself involved into those processes? And what most of modern economics has done is decided, well, we'll just ignore the monetary system itself, and we'll instead just signal to people and businesses and consumers and whatever, financial participants, what we want them to do, and they'll do the stuff for us, and they'll create the inflation. So we signal to them, they act, the inflation and growth is what follows. And so, negative interest rates. Negative interest rates are more of a signal than anything else. When that didn't work, they decided, well, we'll do something called overshooting, which said that, okay, we're going to what we know inflation's coming, but we're not only do we know inflation's coming, we're not going to interrupt it. We're going to let it get hot. We're going to let it go higher than 2% and stay above 2% for a prolonged period of time. So in terms of signaling and inflation expectations, this was supposed to be the most powerful thing the central bankers in Japan had come up with yet.
That's right. Earlier you said central bankers don't do money. And many of our new guests and listeners may say, well, can that be? Well, and we've talked about it in previous shows. In the 70s and 80s, the control of money supply slipped away Clearly, obviously it was slipping away earlier, but it was slipped away completely beyond their control, and they hoped to affect money supply by affecting those that were creating it, which, as you said, were the private financial institutions. Okay, so by the way, that decision, you remember the negative interest rate decision was 5-4, so it was very contentious. You said it was a total disaster, and at least 4 members didn't even want to do it. Let's say, okay, they said, the Bank of Japan, this negative interest rate thing's not working. Maybe what we can do is expand the monetary base. And if you stopped people in the street, Jeff, and you asked them, expand the monetary base, they would say, yeah, cash, checks, coins, that's the monetary base. But that is not what the Bank of Japan was doing. And you know what? The people of Japan don't believe the Bank of Japan. That's the most fascinating thing. Isn't that right, Jeff? They didn't act as if they were going to blow past 2%.
Yeah, well, the Bank of Japan had been doing those two things simultaneously. They had been what they called expanding the monetary base, and they literally said that in the various press releases, not just associated with this new overshooting policy in September of 2016, but all the way back to QQE in April of 2013, 3 years beforehand. The Bank of Japan said, we're going to expand the monetary base by creating bank reserves. That's what quantitative easing is. Where it became qualitative easing in addition to quantitative easing, this extra Q and QQE was the things that the asset classes the Bank of Japan was going to buy. So what the Japanese said was, we're going to buy all sorts of assets. We're going to rate, and the byproduct of buying all these assets from banks in the Japanese banking system was that we're going to raise the level of bank reserves in the banking system, which they called the monetary base. And so for the layperson on the street, they say, oh, the Bank of Japan just said, we're going to buy all sorts of stuff. So we're going to, quote unquote, support all sorts of markets. There's going to be trillions upon trillions, hundreds of trillions in Japanese yen bank reserves created as a byproduct. How can this stuff not be inflationary, right? The Bank of Japan has gone insane. Except, as we just referenced, more than 2.5 years later, they decided, well, this isn't working. We're going to have to try to add a negative interest rate policy. And then another 8 months later, further on, now we got to then get into inflation overshooting. But for most people, you see the level of bank reserves rising, and you think, well, something's happening. And so a lot of people believe that this must be inflationary, but yet there's never any inflation. And that's really the point when we get into this overshooting is here we are 3 years later after QQE had begun, and they're still trying to add things to it. Because remember, when QQE was first introduced, this was the most powerful, irresponsible, reckless monetary printing ever conceived since Weimar Germany. Yeah, so why are we still tinkering with it year after year after year? And it's a contradiction that central bankers really don't want to get into, because it leads us back to the central conclusion, which is these bank reserves, yes, you can call them base money. Central bankers can say they're base money, but in any effective sense in the private system, they're just inert. They're worthless. They're useless. They don't do anything. They're basically inert tokens that sit there on a balance sheet somewhere.
Laundromat tokens, interbank money. And if you're not within the banking system, then maybe you're not interested in using bank reserves. Jeff, the people of Japan didn't react to this because, guess what? They've been in a depression since the 90s, and they've been experiencing radical, unorthodox, monetary, crazy, irrational, irresponsible monetary policy since the late 90s, early 2000s. So 10 years later, here comes another monetary policy. Yawn. But maybe something truly radical could change the mood. And actually, you didn't bring this up in your article, but you have previously, is in that period between the negative interest rate policy announcement and then the one in September regarding the overshooting, there were rumors of helicopters. But it seemed like that never happened. Do you think maybe why did they back down? Any thoughts that you may have? Could that have radically upset the apple cart?
Well, I think from the perspective of the central bank, what central bankers and monetary officials are thinking is we want to be able to control whatever it is we do. And so the idea of just a blanket helicopter, that was thrown around there quite a lot. I don't really think it was ever seriously considered. It's one of those things that maybe came up in a conversation. And of course, it goes into the official record that, yeah, they talked about it, but I don't believe it was ever seriously considered because there's really no way to do it. There's no real way to accomplish it. And I think that's why a lot of people are interested in what the Federal Reserve is now doing with their digital accounts and things like that, because they're wondering, oh, maybe central bankers are figuring out a way to solve this helicopter problem, and then they'll just start doing it. But that's not, I mean, that's not really what central banks are. That's not in their DNA. It's not in their modern DNA of what central banks actually want to accomplish, which is to make people think things, not actually do things, because let's face it, they can't do it. They can't do much with the monetary system. So in Japan in 2016, it was about how do we enhance our signaling process? And what you just pointed out, Emil, is absolutely correct. For the Japanese people, it's like, another one? I mean, at some point, it just becomes noise. No matter how irresponsible and how crazy the financial media goes, and especially in the financial media, they go gaga over these things as if they're absolutely tremendously powerful programs. When most people are just, they've already tuned it out because after 15 years or so, it's just like, okay, here comes another one. And really, in thinking about it that way, here comes another one. You're already ignoring it because the last one didn't work. That seems to be the message that financial media never writes about, is the fact that this stuff never works. And if you have to keep tinkering with it, after the biggest thing ever, you have to keep tinkering with it again and again, year after year. It obviously wasn't the biggest thing ever. It obviously wasn't the thing that you said it was. It just doesn't work.
I'll tell you what the Bank of Japan would say here. They would say, Jeff, you're being unfair, because when we kicked off QQE, it was right into the teeth of the third euro-dollar eruption disorder. And by the way, this one was right off our coast. It was the East Asian euro-dollar disorder. But guess what, Jeff? Now we held the line, and now we're entering into globally synchronized growth. They didn't know it at the time, but we're entering into globally synchronized growth, and that's why we're going to overshoot, because we're generating this money into an expanding economy. So, Jeff, how did they do reaching 2%, breaking past 2% inflation, and then staying there once globally synchronized growth, the wind was at their back?
Well, first of all, let's be specific. They were so confident, or at least they projected so much confidence in September 2016 when they announced this policy. They didn't just say, hey, we're going to let the CPI go above 2% and stay there. They said, we're going to let the core CPI go up above 2% and stay there. And what they meant by core CPI was, in Japan, food inflation is the most volatile component. So they moved fresh food prices out of the consumer bucket. So they said core inflation, which is CPI less fresh food, that number is going to go above 2% and stay there. And you're right, Emil. They did this in September 2016. Underneath all of that, there was the first rumblings of globally synchronized growth that came that were apparent by 2017. So from this point, you would have thought they had everything going for them from September 2016 forward. How could this not possibly succeed? But when you look at the CPI, especially the CPI less fresh food, they didn't even get halfway. In fact, they only got halfway, 1% inflation in the core CPI in 3 out of 50 months. They couldn't even do half the inflation with everything at their back, with reflation number 3 and 22nd, globally synchronized growth. All of this QQE mania, negative interest rates were still enforced at that point. I mean, the central bank was throwing everything that they could possibly think of, buying every asset class under the sun while they were doing all of this. And they couldn't even get the inflation to halfway what they were saying is our target, let alone go above that target and stay there for any prolonged period of time. So, rather than enhance the credibility, as the statement always says, as you pointed out, Emil, Japanese people are like, yeah, okay, yeah, this is just more noise. It doesn't work. It never works.
Well, for those of you that are hearing an echo, that were perhaps watching CNBC in late August, this sounds really familiar, especially if you're anywhere in North America, this plan of getting to your targeted inflation rate and going way above it. Well, maybe not way, I'm overdoing it. Okay, but staying above it. We'll talk about that. I'll let Jeff talk about that if he wants to. Jeff, the reason we're bringing all this up is because late Thursday the 19th, New York time, early Friday 20th Tokyo time. The Statistics Bureau of Japan announced the core inflation rate year over year, the inflation rate excluding food and energy, excluding food, the month over month numbers. What did we learn? What are the most recent months saying regarding inflation in Japan?
Well, this core inflation rate, the CPI less fresh food, was, I believe, minus 0.7% year over year, which, again, minus deflation. And minus 0.7 is the lowest, most deflationary number Japan has seen since before the tsunami in 2011. So almost their worst, absolute worst inflationary result. So outright deflation in a sustained fashion, too, since 2011. And it's not just September or October where this deflation showed up. It's actually been pretty consistent since the March contraction globally. So Japan is back into a very serious deflationary episode, which, again, the most serious deflationary episode in over a decade. And at the same time, we have to note, Bank of Japan is back doing its quote-unquote money printing, expanding the monetary base, and doing so at a rate that it has never done before. So it's going back into the QQE business, creating all these trillions and hundreds of trillions of bank reserves. I believe they're now just shy of 700 trillion in assets on the Bank of Japan's balance sheet. So closing in on a quadrillion in yen assets, and instead of even the hint of inflation, Japan is deeply and even more deeply entrenched back in deflation again. So we say again, this stuff does not work. It's a signal to people to act, and the people, as you pointed out, Emil, are saying, we've seen this stuff for decades. Why would we even think it has even the remotest possibility of being effective?
Well, you know what it is, though, Jeff, is Resident Evil is actually a Japanese game, and there's some great scenes in these movies in Japan where the heroine has got a pair of katana swords, and she's slicing through zombies. It's fabulous. It's nighttime. It's raining. She's got on a great set of clothes. Perhaps it's a nightgown, which is how you usually fight zombies. The point I'm trying to make, Jeff, is that the reason they're struggling right now, despite all the money printing, is because there's an infestation, like in Resident Evil. It's the corona, the COVID. Is that what we see in Japan right now? Is that what's holding them back, the economy?
No, not at all. And I think that's the point. You know, if you look at Japan, Japan has the lowest incidence of cases and the absolute lowest amount of deaths. I think it's about 1,700 total deaths out of a country with 126 million people population. And the Japanese have never, I mean, Japanese are very, very, very much aware of private rights. The Japanese government has never imposed a nationwide lockdown or even regional lockdowns. In fact, they've said, hey, take, social distancing, use masks, which are people in Asia use masks much more than people do here. All the precautions but if you're non-essential, maybe think about working from home, all that kind of stuff. But they never imposed lockdowns. They never had a surge in cases. They didn't have any kind of massive mortality from it. And so it's not a COVID problem in Japan. And as you pointed out, the zombie, Emil, the zombie analogy, it isn't COVID, it isn't yen, it isn't Bank of Japan. It's always dollars. Japan is a global participant in the respect that their marginal economic activity is derived from how the rest of the world is doing. And so if the rest of the world is doing very poorly, Japan's got no chance. And it doesn't matter what the Bank of Japan does with QQE because they're not printing money. They're not printing any money that's usable in the real economy. They're printing bank reserves that, as we talked about, I believe, last week or the week before, they're printing these yen bank reserves that Japanese banks yen use as collateral, or at least the entryway into collateral, to do dollar swaps. So it always comes back to the dollar. And I think what's really most important about this when we talk about Japan is most people say, okay, yeah, but that's Japan. The Japanese, they have no idea what they're doing. Obviously, this stuff doesn't work in Japan, but you put this stuff in the hands of the Federal Reserve, that'll definitely work. And that's certainly how the people of the Federal Reserve feel. But, you should notice, as what we're talking about here, overshooting. That should sound familiar because what is overshooting? Well, in the Federal Reserve's terms, it became a symmetrical inflation target in May of 2018. So a couple of years ago, the Fed already borrowed that aspect of Japanese monetary policy where they said, we're going to let inflation go above our target and remain above our target. And it also sounds like average inflation targeting, which the Federal Reserve unveiled as their brand new policy underlying strategy in August of this year, where they said the same thing. Again, this overshooting target that didn't work in Japan, that didn't work as a symmetrical inflation target in the Federal Reserve context in 2018, but now it's even deeper. Now we're going to average our inflation target, which is supposed to mean we're going to let inflation go above it and stay above it for an even longer period of time to balance out all those years where the Federal Reserve couldn't even achieve their inflation target. And it's all just nonsense. And it's not just overshooting. It's not just inflation target. It's QQE. What has the Federal Reserve been doing since March? Essentially the same thing as Japan did in April of 2013, which was QQE, this expanded monetary base, this expanded asset classes for purchases and all this other stuff. So whatever the Japanese have done and failed at, the Federal Reserve has already copied and adopted it, and they haven't worked yet. So when you say that, okay, we're just going to ignore Japan's experience as something that we shouldn't pay attention to because it's Japanese, you have to understand that the Federal Reserve has copied the Japanese going back more than a decade. And so the Fed hasn't had any success. The Japanese haven't had any success. So why should we expect all of a sudden that it's going to start working in the way that it was intended? And not even working in the way it is intended. Some people are saying it's going to work too well. It's going to release this inflationary monster that nobody will be able to control, when it hasn't worked anywhere. Not just Japan, Europe, the United States, all of these things, inflation targets, QQE, monetary, all of it. It's all been tested. It's all been tried all over the world for decades. It doesn't work because it's not what you think it is.
Let's take a look, though. Let's see if you're right, Jeff. Let's take a look at Europe, the latest economic data over there, and let's take a look at the United States in part 2 of episode 37. That's where we're going to go, and I'm going to give the audience a little bit of a hint. Some of the data in one of those two regions is different. Perhaps it's signaling that Jeff is wrong, that it is working somewhere.